So welcome everybody. We'll get rolling. We have a ton to cover. We have put a lot of work into figuring out all the ins and outs of what's happening in donor advised funds in 2021, what you should do about it. And so just as we get started, a really big thank you to my colleagues Magda and Simone, who are also on the call. They put a ton of work into researching this so that we had all the up-to-date facts and everything ready to share for you. So lots and lots of hours went into this, some of them by me, mostly not by me. And so a big thank you to those folks. Quick note here, this session is approved for CFRE credits. A lot of you have limited professional development budgets these days, so we're delighted to be able to do this for free. We have a question to the survey to certify your participation. A couple times this week, people have actually reached out to me and said, hey, we're being audited right now about our CFRE credits. Can you make sure that you give us a record of participation, excuse me. And so if you make a note there, we keep all the records on the back end. If you ever get audited, we just send you a quick email that says this is to prove that Diana attended 14 of these and has all the credits she needs for continuing professional certification. So just make sure you do that at the end. Today's agenda, we'll do some quick introductions. We'll talk about DAF giving in 2020, 2019, and what to expect in 2021. We'll talk about navigating some different types of donor advised funds. We'll talk about how to find donor advised funds. Actually, in the last minute, we added a couple more things, so there's more than 4. We talked about some advanced strategies on donor advised funds, and then we'll do Q&A. I will go a little bit quickly because we have so much to cover. We'll send the recording afterwards, so don't feel like you have to take notes furiously. And apologies if I do talk a little quickly, but I want to make sure that we get to all of these tactics and strategies for you and get you out well before an hour so you can get on to your next meeting. So introductions, I'm really lucky to know many of you. My name is Patrick. On the left here is my wonderful and brilliant co-founder, Jenny Schaaf-Spradling. We are really lucky to be the co-founders of FreeWill. Our team is now, we hit 75 this week, so that's really exciting with some new people, and that's great. And we crossed $2.2 billion in money raised for charity. So we have a lot of smiles going around here. Last week, we sent 20 people a gift, which is one of my favorite books. So this book is called One Page at a Time. You actually just read it one page at a time, once a day or whenever you want to. And it's a great sort of creative, happiness bringing. We know a lot of folks had a hard 2020, and so this is just the gift that we're sending out for another 20 folks to help you have a great year. So just make a quick note in the survey, give us your probably home address if that's where you're receiving packages, and hopefully we'll get that out to another 20 folks today. So just something we're trying to do our best here to be professionally helpful, but also know that there's been a lot of stress in everybody's life. And this is one thing that I use quite frequently, and it's really fun. All right, so how is your week going? We asked this generally, and it's really interesting to see how this changes over time. One thing you're seeing is this blue line is shifting back up. This sort of happiness is now the dominant emotion, almost half. Anxiety is coming a lot down. If you recall, right before the last week we met, there was all the issues at the Capitol, and so you can see how you see that giant spike. That was when the election was in doubt and it wasn't clear who was the victor and who would accept results. So you can see how macro events in the world actually are affecting people's individual behavior and feelings. And so nice to see, look how low loneliness is. It's the lowest it's ever been. So hopefully this community is helping as well. Also, what are you worried about? We're starting to see some uptick here in hitting goals, a little bit worried about coworkers' safety, donors' health and safety. Very few people are worried about losing their job compared to where that number might have been back April. So that's really good news as well. All right, so let's dive in on donor advised funds. And we asked you, what do you think about donor advised funds? So we'll get into a bunch of research soon, but look, you can see a couple of things here, right? So people see it's a big opportunity, excited, potential, hopeful. Also that really big word at the bottom is confused, or frustrated, or untapped, or challenged, intrigued, growth, unsure, uneasy, conflicted. So there's a lot of different things going on here, right? We think this is a really important thing. We don't always know exactly what to do about it. Also, sometimes people think, is this good for the world? Is it bad for the world? The answer is probably yes to both of those. And so we'll talk more about that going forward. So before we get into this, I know that a lot of you are super confident about these. Some of you, this might be totally new. So we're gonna take a minute just to really align on what we're talking about when we mean donor advised funds. So at its very core, donors put money into an investment fund with a sponsoring organization, and then they recommend grants out of the charity to a later point. A donor gets an immediate tax benefit, which is a big benefit to these, even if the money doesn't go to charity for years. So you might think, well, that probably increases the amount of money going in, but also that money is not going to charity as soon. Now, donors technically recommend grants because this money is moved to a 501c3, so that sponsoring organizations really have control legally. They very, very rarely will go against the donor's wishes. So really, the donor still has control of it, even though it's with this sponsoring organization. Otherwise, people wouldn't really give the money in, and the sponsoring organizations do what they can to honor the donor's wishes. Now, what else do we know? We know that money is usually invested in this account, meaning it doesn't just stay there. It often goes into different funds and mutual funds and index funds, can go to specific stocks, although that tends to be rare. And this is so that that money grows over time. And then how do people actually make money who are running donor advised funds? Well, they make money on what are called management fees, right? Possibly twice. And what we mean there is a management fee for the overall fund. So you might get a 1% fee a year to help run the fund. And then oftentimes, if you're a Fidelity or Schwab or Vanguard, the money that is being invested is invested in a Vanguard or Fidelity or Schwab fund. And those funds have what are called BIPs, which are basically parts per million. And in that case, they're getting some fund fee on mutual funds. So someone's managing the overall fund. Those people are getting 1% or so. Someone is managing the index fund that the money is going into, or the mutual fund that the money is going into, and there's a fee there as well. This isn't to judge it as good or bad. This is just so you understand how these organizations work, because the more that we can understand the different incentive structures, you can then begin to think, well, what are my strategies based on this structure? We asked you whether donor advised funds are a priority for your organization, and you can see it's pretty big. So 26% say a very high priority, and another third say a somewhat high priority. So between that, you're at almost 60%. And then 27% say a medium priority, only 4% say not a priority at all. So overall, we see across the board a really big focus for nonprofit organizations on donor advised funds. So let's understand exactly how those work, why they're growing, and then what to do about it. So we also asked some key challenges, and we'll dig into these later. But what are the biggest things that the biggest hurdles you're facing around donor advised funds? 76% say, I need help figuring out who has a donor advised fund. So we took these feedback and really focused a lot of our work today and a lot of the coaching that we'll do on how to help figure out who has a donor advised fund. A lot of folks don't know how to market donor advised funds as well. So we'll talk more about that and give you some very specific strategies. And 36% say, I struggle to find out the identities of some people who give us DAF gifts, meaning a check shows up, but there's no name attached to it. You can't say thank you. You can't steward those people. Big problem as well. And 12% say, I wish my donor advised fund gifts would arrive faster. So we won't focus on that as much. It's really helpful when folks take what we call the pre-survey. That allows us to shape the research and the work that we do to make sure we're answering the biggest questions that you have. So what has happened with donor advised funds in the past few years? And what does that mean about what's going to happen in 2021? So one thing that's really interesting here, this is from the NPT, the National Philanthropic Trust. And they publish this report every year. This report actually, I believe, did not come out in early 2020. And you can imagine why. Everybody's really busy. And so the research that happened, we don't have 2019 numbers. But what we can do is we can look at trends over time. So you see this is total value of money going into donor advised funds, right? Per year, 20 billion in 2014, almost doubling within 4 years. And this is remarkable growth. And when we extrapolate the growth here, we think that in 2021, you will see $50 to $55 billion going into donor advised funds here, right? So what we don't have right now is data for 2019. We don't have data for 2020, and then we're projecting 2021. But if you follow the logical trends here, this is the size of what's happening. Now, remember, all charitable giving at a system-wide level is about $430 billion a year. That will go up a little bit as well, but this is a really significant portion of it. So money coming out of donor advised funds is growing too. So you see only $12 billion was given out in 2014. That doubled by 2018. And it grew dramatically in 2020, which we'll talk about in a moment. So what you might think of is that we're probably looking at $31 to $40 billion coming out of donor advised funds. And this is a remarkable amount of individual giving that we're seeing. So 31 to 40 billion, rough estimates. We'll check back after the year and let you know if we were right or not. But that's generally the direction that we're heading in. And then money growing inside donor advised funds. This is how much money is just in all of these accounts combined. You can see it went from 70 billion in 2014 to 121 billion. This is massive. Fidelity's DAF is the largest nonprofit in America, outstripping the United Way in a bunch of years. And so what we might think by 2021 is 150 billion to 200 billion dollars sitting in these accounts. So huge, huge sums and a really, really big opportunity, also a pretty big challenge. And then when we look at this, it's not just that giving overall is going up. I mean, look at how drastic this graph is. This is the percentage of contributions to donor advised funds among all individual giving. And you can see by 2018, it's almost 13%. It's only 4% in 2010. So this is just a huge shift. I mean, it's tripled in 8 years. And if we think about what it might look like, we might see 14 to 17% of all giving in the United States in 2021 goes to donor advised funds. Now, quick point here, we do have a bunch of folks from Canada on the call. These are US specific numbers. These trends seem to be happening similarly across countries. So your numbers will be much smaller. Obviously, total giving in Canada and population are much smaller, but this sort of upward trend is pretty significant on both sides of the border. All right, so what happened in 2020? Well, we saw this massive surge of giving out of donor advised funds in 2020. So all of the major DAF sponsors, that's what we call these big funds, saw huge increases in DAF grants during 2020. Nonprofit trusts, which really does the best job reporting, saw a 15% increase in the number of grants and a 64% increase in dollar amount of grants from March to May over the same time period. One of the things that folks would say is that April is the new December, because typically December is the biggest time of giving. Not because there's any tax advantage in giving out of a donor advised fund in December, but people are mentally locked in to that end of year giving. And so you saw a really big increase here. Donor focus shifted to public and social benefit organizations, and 60% of grants were unrestricted, which was a really big shift from the past. So hopefully that will continue to give you all more flexibility in terms of giving. Now, let's take a quick look, and we won't go too in depth here. So you can watch the recording and freeze this if you want to dive in a bit. But you see this percentage increase by different types of organizations. Now, a couple things stand out here. One, public and social benefit. These are things like food banks or community shelters, up by 140%. Health, up by 106%. Environment and animals, up by 340%, right? So suddenly, I think in particular, some of the animal groups did some really good work around protecting pets during the pandemic, and there's a massive shift. Now, those groups had much smaller percentages of giving to start, up 5%. Now, a couple other things to note here. Culture and art, right? A lot of these museums shut down, operas and symphonies shut down, and yet you still see an increase here. So we saw both the pie growing overall and a couple of really big spikes in some of these areas. So you might not have thought that during a pandemic, giving to culture and art goes up, and yet giving across the board went up to such a degree that it went up for culture and art as well. So really interesting stuff there, and some hope for some of the organizations in that field that are struggling a bit right now, especially with less earned revenue. One thing that I want to dive in here, and this is really important, both to understand the different types of donor advised funds, but also it helps us start uncover clues about why these donor advised funds are growing and why some are not. So there are three big types of donor advised funds. One sits in community foundations. A lot of major cities have these. Certainly some religious entities will have them either regionally or nationally. And these community foundations are holding money, and then they're making grants out based on donor recommendations. Now, the second category is national donor advised funds, things like Fidelity, Schwab, et cetera. And then the third is what we call single issue DAFs. So the Nature Conservancy has one, Harvard has one, Notre Dame has one. These are pretty limited to the largest national nonprofits, folks like the Nature Conservancy, or the top 20 or 30 universities in terms of endowment size. So it's not universal. It's frankly relatively complex. And either you have a massive back office team that can handle this, or you don't. We're actually starting to see some folks have some pretty good success there. Also, some nonprofits give up on it entirely because it's too much work and isn't generating a lot of gifts. So we are going to skip focus on number 3 because it won't be relevant to 98% of you at all. But let's look at the size on how this is, how each are growing, because this is a really important thing to understand the trends behind it. So community foundations, these numbers are 2018, by the way, because that's the latest accurate donations. 33.4 billion, a 15% decrease from the year before. So really meaningfully, DAFs are going up, but community foundation DAFs are actually going down. Now, national DAFs, $72 billion in assets, 23% growth. So what we see here is that all of the growth is happening in this category because they're the largest and the growth is happening the fastest. And then your third category, 3.73 billion, 10% growth. Again, you can see how much smaller this is, about 1/10 the size of community foundations, about 1/20th the size of national DAFs, growing at 10%. So less important as a sector. It may be obviously very important to your specific university, but we'll talk about that less. So this number is really important to understand, both on its own and in contrast to number 1. Right? Why might some donor advised funds be growing while others are decreasing? So we'll answer that in a moment. Big question though. So many people are saying, great, donor advised funds are growing. What do I do about it? My boss is telling me to do this. My board is telling me to do this. And what I realize is that very few people are taking a beat to say, wait, but why is this happening? What are the massive trends at a nationwide level that are shifting that cause something to grow? And it's not just an accident. Why are donor advised funds growing so much more quickly than the rest of charitable giving? And so we'll really dive into 3 reasons here. So the reason 1, and this is in more recent years, is a shift in tax policy. So I'll go through this a little bit slowly because I'm not sure everybody understands it immediately, although some of you this will be old news to. The standard minimum deduction increased in 2018. And a couple of the big deduction categories, like how much you can deduct for paying state and local taxes, how much you can deduct for paying your mortgage, got capped. So fewer and fewer people are itemizing deductions. What that means is that some people are putting a whole bunch of money in donor advised funds in 1 year and then giving out over 3 years. Now, why would you do that? Well, whole big money in 1 year, get a big tax deduction, and then I don't itemize deductions in the next few years, and so I don't sort of see any of the cost there. So that's one reason why some of this is happening. Remember, only about 10% of people in 2020 and 2021 are going to itemize tax deductions, which is a huge shift from 2017 when number was 30%. And so some of you are really focused on gifts that are called qualified charitable distributions. These are gifts out of an IRA for older people. These are exploding too because of the same dynamic here, that people are hungry for some sort of tax savings because they're so used to charitable giving being tax beneficial, and yet 90% of American adults, or those at least filing taxes, aren't getting any additional tax benefit from donating cash. And so going into a donor advised fund in a big sum and then chunking it out over years is one shift. 2, one thing we're seeing is that more and more donors are trying to give non-cash assets. So things like stock, things like real estate, what they're realizing is how valuable the taxes are. And frankly, there's just more of this stuff. So increases in the stock market are making assets more valuable, which means giving 100 shares of Apple stock is actually just a lot more money in 2018 or in 2021 than it was in 2014. So we have this long bull market, basically since 2008, 2009. And so if people are trying to give away their assets, they actually just have more assets. So that's a really big shift here. Donors are getting smarter about the tax benefits of stock giving, in part because of what we just walked through, in part because there's just more information out there about how to give intelligently. And a gift of stock can save up to something like 70% of tax savings on a gift. Now, very, very quickly, that's because you don't pay any capital gains on these taxes. And in most cases, you'll get a full federal income tax deduction and potentially a state deduction as well. So you have this huge, huge combined savings, and it almost always makes sense to give appreciated stock over cash. And so more and more people are turning to this, and so more of those gifts are going into DAFs. And so, but here's this sort of interesting tweak, right? Everyone says, okay, great, that all makes sense. Well, if tax changes and donor behavior are changing, why are DAFs at community foundations getting smaller, right? We would think that these trends are pushing all, or lifting all boats. And yet community foundations are getting smaller in terms of DAFs, and these national ones are getting much larger. So therefore, national DAFs must be doing something different to drive growth if these macro factors are in play, and yet community foundations are going down while national DAFs are going through the roof. So what is that? Well, what it means is that they're just making it super easy and intuitive to give stock and other non-cash gifts. Now, part of this is they have a built-in advantage, right? So if you have a Fidelity account and you're trading stocks, it's very easy to be like, okay, great, let me move some of that into my donor advised fund. But what you can see here is that 64% of contributions into Schwab Charitable are non-cash assets. So mostly stock here. Some real estate, some boats, some cars, but mostly publicly traded stocks and private holdings or private stocks as well. So almost 2/3 of all of the stuff going into this massively growing segment of philanthropy is stock or similar. So really, really interesting shift here. And what happens is it's just quite easy to give these organizations stock. They're very good at processing it. They're very good at pointing folks to it. And they remind people all the time that you can give stock or other things like that, because they know that that is the fastest way to grow their donor advised fund. So this is really interesting. Community foundations have not been as good at A, making it easy, or B, reminding people that they can give this stuff. And that's why you see this actually pretty big shift, even though the macro environment is the same for community foundations and these big donor advised funds. So really interesting stuff. Before we get into what to do about it, understanding exactly why this is happening is really important. Okay, so that is an overview of the growth of donor advised funds and particularly why it happened. Let's talk about how to actually find folks with these DAFs. So there's no big list anywhere. Fidelity won't sell you a list of donor advised fund holders because they really value their clients' privacy. So how might you go about finding these people who are holding on to that 100 billion plus amount of money in their donor advised fund? So first, let's understand what's happening here. As you look at the number of donor advised fund accounts, you can see them growing pretty slowly from 2014 to 2015 to 2016, and then really big jumps from 2017 to 2018. Now, a couple things are happening. One, these are becoming more popular overall. We've talked about the tax changes. We've talked about how people are looking to give non-cash assets. Also, Fidelity, Schwab, Vanguard are putting a lot of money into marketing to get more people to open these. What's happening here? Well, one, this is a really important point. So coming back to this very quickly, what this means is that in 2018, not just are DAFs growing, there are almost 300,000 people who've never had a DAF before who newly have a DAF, right? And the year before, there were 200,000 people that this is their first year with a donor advised fund, and they're sort of figuring out, hey, what do I do with this? What do other people like me do in this situation? So a couple things. You need to remember that DAFs are new to you, right? You're here because you're trying to figure out, how do I really nail this? It seems important, it seems big. It also means they're incredibly new to donors who are still trying to understand how to use them. So there's a really big opportunity to shape behavior right now during this DAF explosion for decades to come. Once people get into the habit of using their DAF in a certain way, then you'll be able to get these recurring gifts over time. So a lot of work going in right now is going to help you for the next decade. Now, another fascinating thing is that 80% of donors are over 50 in terms of money of DAFs. But 13% of DAFs that were in 2019 were opened by millennials. Now, that doesn't really make sense. I mean, millennials have much less money than baby boomers or the silent generation. So why might that be? Well, it turns out that a lot of workplaces are adding donor advised funds as a perk. So if you're a millennial making $75,000 a year, there's basically no way you're going to be itemizing deductions on your taxes. But you can put pre-tax money into a donor advised fund, and suddenly you have this pool of giving. So remember that massive jump. Watch this. So one thing that's happening is you have this massive jump, but actually the donor advised funds are getting smaller. We're sort of moving from something that is exclusively for wealthy people to a more mainstream type of giving. And so the average donor advised fund is going down as the number goes up, because you have some folks like millennials who are not that well-to-do, but are trying to move a couple $1,000s a year into this as well. So really interesting dynamic. you're basically seeing, this happens with a lot of technologies actually. So you guys remember when VCRs came out, when CD players came out, when home computers came out, like all your rich friends had them first, right? The wealthiest people have them, and gradually they become more affordable and accessible. The same is true with donor advised funds as a technology. Even though it doesn't feel like tech, it's just another process and innovation that people are using. And so this is becoming more and more mainstream. And you might expect this continues to become more mainstream overall. So look for this trend to continue. We're probably past 1 million donor advised funds in the country right now. So let's talk about finding our donor advised fund donors. And originally it was 4, but now it's 6 steps because we keep uncovering some new tactics for you. So first, every time you request a gift via marketing, these donor advised funds should be available. So something like give from my donor advised fund link on a checkout page or a donate page. You want a checkbox. Even when people are donating, it just says, hey, I have a donor advised fund and I would like to learn more about giving to the organization this way. So every time you're touching a donor, remember there's 1 million donor advised funds in the country. So the odds that some of your donors have them is very, very high. And these donors are going to be the people you can go back to for increasingly large gifts. And every time you ask a survey, just put a quick question. Many people are doing donor advised funds. Would you like some more information about giving this way? In every major donor conversation, so if we think there's 1 million donor advised funds, most of your major donors are going to have one, or at least half, maybe a third. So how might you ask that without being too upfront? You'd say something like this. Many of our supporters give out of our donor advised fund. Would you like information on how other people are using their DAF to make a big impact? And they might say, no, I don't have one. Or yes, help me out with some best practices here. And you can always say, this is going to be true for any of your giving as a way to be an advisor and not just someone who is, asking for money for your organization. It's always helpful to have 1 or more donor stories here as well. These can be pretty straightforward. 3, sometimes we hear this. You want to tag everyone you find in your survey and your donor conversations who has a DAF, even if they haven't given this way yet, which is really important. Sometimes people say, oh, my database doesn't have a tag like that. This is so important that you should just pick a different thing that you're not using and say, this internally is what we think of as donor advised funds, right? So it might be, gives by check or something else that is not as important as knowing they have a donor advised fund, and you can just repurpose that tag and make sure everybody in your organization knows that. By the way, this is really important. So a lot of times gifts come, but they don't have a name attached to them, which is a huge problem. So just on your ways to give page or anywhere you're putting donor advised funds, you might want to use this specific language. When you make a donor advised fund gift, it is possible that the sponsoring organization will not share your info with us. Please send a note here or fill out this form. This can be a very basic Google form. Don't put too much effort into it. When you've made a gift, so we can make sure to thank you and ensure your gift gets to where it's intended. The last thing you want is a donor advised fund gift, especially if you're a hospital or a college with dozens or hundreds of different places to give, that just goes to the general fund and the donor is really frustrated. All right, let's talk about navigating national donor advised funds, because we get a lot of questions say, wow, Fidelity has billions and billions and billions of dollars. How do I go to Fidelity to get more of these gifts? Keep in mind that these have a much less active role. And these folks are not seen by many donors as philanthropic experts. Outreach to the big DAFs is probably a poor use of time, and you want to focus instead on cultivating donors. But you do want to make sure that your GuideStar profile is up to date, as this is a resource that when we talk to the folks in national DAFs, they use quite frequently to be able to make sure that we're routing the money correctly, but also to understand who's in good standing, et cetera. You also want to understand the massive growth of accounts of these entities, and we'll talk about a couple of steps you can do that as well. And then we talk about community foundations. This has a more active role in recommending nonprofits, especially if you're a local charity. So if you're thinking about doing outreach, we know that community foundations are smaller, but they're also going to be much more receptive to this. You want to be proactive now. You can set up a coffee or a tea to understand, even if it's over Zoom, obviously, what donors are looking to fund. So you can come to foundation staff when you have a great fit. So this is a really big shift, and not everybody does it. So I want to sort of restate it quickly. When you go to a community foundation, don't say, hey, here's everything we do. Say, what are the key areas of focus the big donors you have are looking to fund, so that if we have a project, we can bring it to you and help you make your job easier by really matching that correctly. So instead of thinking about, hey, let me just give a presentation on how great we are, which you are great, but when you have specific funding areas of focus, then it will be much more helpful. So, and when you go, don't just say, this is our organization, we've been around for 30 years, we do X, Y, and Z. Say, look, these are the these are the projects, and these are the funding opportunities. So if anybody wants to come in and help take care of this, that gift officer or that program officer at the community foundation will be able to match you appropriately. So this is a big shift. Just make sure you're asking more questions than talking, and that you're sharing specific things instead of just broadly great things about your nonprofit. A quick note here, I'm always surprised at how rarely past board members get reached out to. So board members, especially your older board members, are the most likely to have a donor advised fund, right? They fit the demographics, they fit the psychographics, they fit the behavioral trends of DAF donors. You as a gift officer or as a development director should have a list of past board members, call a check-in on them in the next few weeks, see how their 2020 went, see what they're thinking about for 2021. And this is where you can work in that earlier language around donor advised funds. So these people are your prime candidates. If you're going to start anywhere, starting with current and past board members is obviously key. Everyone remembers current board members. Everybody forgets past board members. Those people are actually getting less attention from you right now. And a phone call or an update on what your organization is doing can go a long way in generating some really serious gifts. And then this is really important, right? So often your board or your executive director will say, we need to get more DAFs. And what we need to understand is that 60% of all money going into DAFs is in non-cash assets, primarily stock. And we talked about this a little bit earlier, but donor advised funds make it particularly easy to make non-cash gifts, which is most of the reason why they're growing so much, right? Because otherwise you'd see community foundations growing at the same rate. But it's how easy they make giving non-cash gifts, which is responsible for growing by tens of billions of dollars in a very short time. So if you can make it easy and accessible for your donors to give you stock, many will skip the DAF. It's way easier to get the gift right away than to have the donor give it all to the DAF and then wait, a couple years to come to you, or maybe go elsewhere. If someone has appreciated securities, appreciated stock, that money needs to come to you immediately instead of this triangular strategy. And a lot of organizations miss this. They just think, wow, that number is big in terms of donor advised funds, without remembering how it got big in the first place. So this is really important. In normal fundraising emails, start including asks around stock giving. You can also include asks around donor advised fund giving. Just in that one hyperlinked sentence that usually says, will you give $20 to help X, Y, and Z, say, please consider donating today using a credit card, gifts of stock, or your donor advised fund. And why is this important? Because the same people who are already going to give you money will give you 5, 10, 15 times more money if they're giving out of their DAFs or if they're giving stock compared to a quick credit card gift. And so you're missing out on major gifts because you're just getting small credit card gifts from the same people who would otherwise give you much larger gifts in non-cash assets. And there's a ton of research that folks have done around this. Many of you know it, but people that focus on non-cash gifts, meaning nonprofits that focus on non-cash gifts, grow 6 times faster than those focusing on cash. So this is incredibly important. You want to place a link to give stock on your donate page, not just on the ways to give page. This is a classic mistake. And basically what happens is the annual fund is in charge of one page, the major giving team is in charge of another. And so the annual fund is actually raising way less money because they're funneling people into the smallest type of gifts instead of allowing them to give much bigger amounts. So big mistake that a lot of organizations make. Make sure to fix that. We highlighted this last week, but just to reiterate it, Southern Poverty Law Center does this really well. You're doing a checkout before it says, enter your credit card. It gives you a couple other ways to give, right? Through stock, easy tool to make stock gifts, easy tool to make gifts out of your IRA, which is a topic for another time, but super, super, super important as it's one of the only tax beneficial ways for older Americans to give. So this slight shift makes this organization, who does wonderful work, even better at fundraising to a pretty significant degree, because they're making sure that people who can are giving big gifts instead of just another $85 credit card gift. All right, so you have that. We've got 20 minutes left, probably do 10 minutes and then leave a bunch of time for questions. Let's talk about some next level strategies that a lot of people aren't employing, but some of the more sophisticated, savvier organizations are doing already. And these things actually take very little work. So that's the sort of stuff that we love, that has really outsized impact, but you're busy and it only takes some slight tweaks. So here we go. One is most donors don't know that a donor advised fund can give a recurring gift. Now, recurring gifts are always better because they're not only is it more money, they're also predictable. So here's some language. If someone gives you a DAF gift, you can say something like, one of the biggest barriers to even more impact is we often don't have certainty about how much money will come in during a given year. Many people choose to make a recurring gift because it allows us to plan more thoughtfully and make the most of your donations. And of course, you can always cancel if you change your mind. Now, what does this do? It signals to the donor, hey, that thing you want for your money to have impact, well, we can have even more impact if you can allow us to plan ahead. And so it doesn't frame it in the, we need this. It frames in the, you want to do this, and we'll help you hit your goals this way. Two, and this is really important for the planned giving professionals on the team, many donors do not have beneficiary designations for their DAFs. So one thing to note here is, one thing I've seen is that many of our donors forget to add beneficiary designations on their donor advised fund. You may have already thought about it, but just in case I wanted to raise it, do you want me to talk you through some of the options? And by offering to talk through options, as opposed to just talking about how to leave it all to our charity, that really opens a conversation. And you can say we can direct it in percentages, you can put somebody else in charge, you can put a child or a spouse or an heir who's going to be in the future in charge of that, and you want to know who that person is, so you can start having conversations with those people as well. Or you can leave it to a cause, and maybe even we think about saying, if you want to do this, we might be able to set up a named scholarship or this level of giving or this particular thing that is important. And that will go a really long way into securing some pretty large gifts. Three, many donors also forget that employers match grants coming from donor advised funds. They don't match grants going into donor advised funds. So you might just say something like this: thank you so much for your grant. You may already know this. Many of our supporters don't realize they can get their gifts matched. Does your employer do matching gifts? And now suddenly you're doubling the value of a lot of donor advised fund gifts with a single email. And the donor is thrilled because their impact is doubled as well. Okay, 4, over 60% of gifts, we've already talked about this, come from non-cash gifts, but also things like real estate, crypto, non-public securities, et cetera. So if a donor has a donor advised fund and they want to give you, some land in Mexico or an antique boat or a collection of highly valuable vases, and that just sounds like a lot of work for you, it probably is. And if you don't have a robust gift processing office that is ready to do this, you can say, great, do you have a donor advised fund? You can donate to the donor advised fund, get the immediate tax benefit, and when it's liquidated, send all the cash our way. So that's just a way to sort of funnel the money in a way that saves you a lot of work, and you can work through the donor with that as well. So things like stock, especially publicly traded stock, you want to make that really easy to give directly to you. But I was talking a year and a half ago to a very large environmental organization. They had just got a huge, incredible value collection of erotic art and had no idea what to do with it. And so that's a good thing. You say, let Fidelity take care of that, and then you can just send us the money. Quick bonus note, there's something called Half My DAF, which in 2020 was matching some gifts out of donor advised funds. And they matched about $1.4 million in gifts. They plan to match at least $2 million in 2021. So you can keep an eye on their website, just Google Half My DAF. They send some sample letters. They have a bunch of other resources here. If it helps you get more money in the door, it's going to be a huge win. All right, so that is a big overview. I want to share a couple of specific resources, and then we'll get to questions, and I'm glad we have a bunch of time for this as well. So first, we've just put together a stock fundraising 101 guide. So this is just a bunch of really key steps, including a bunch of the language that we talked about, how to get more gifts, how to start processing donations, things like that. So there's just a short question in this survey. And if you get a chance, just note that and we'll send it to you that way. It also might be helpful if you feel like you're already a pro at this, it might be helpful for some of your junior staff. We find that a lot of newer nonprofit staff don't really understand non-cash giving, especially if they're younger and might not have any investments at all of their own. And this is a really good way to get them started. Second thing, we're doing a 30-minute demo, not this Thursday, but next Thursday, I guess. Next Thursday with my colleagues, Alyssa and David. So I won't be there. They're leading it. They're wonderful. And they'll walk through some specific major giving tools and some case studies. So if you want to join that, feel free to make a note. And then also, we have this wonderful Smiley team. If you want to set up a one-on-one demo or a walkthrough on either tools around making stock giving easier, making planned giving a lot better, or making qualified charitable distributions, which are these sort of rising gifts coming out of IRAs, just make a small note and we'll set you up with one of these wonderful people and they'll walk you through it. They tend to be really lovely, so you'll enjoy that conversation either way. And then last thing is, we've already talked about this, but do you want to send a bunch of folks this book, mostly because we want you to have a really great year. And so make a note in the survey as well. We are going to move to Q&A. So I'm going to take a minute, read the questions, summarize some of the big ones that are sort of most common. We'll come back to do questions in about 90 seconds, 60 seconds. So just please take this super short survey. My colleague Simone is going to be dropping a link in the chat right now. She already has. So make sure to do that as well. All right, we have lots of good questions. So we'll go through a couple of these and we are definitely not gonna get to all of them. So we'll go for like 5 to 7 minutes, then give everybody a little bit of a break before their 1 o'clock. Let's see. So first question is from Terry. Can donors into donor advised funds control the investment strategies, or does the foundation holding the DAFs control the investment strategies? So what typically happens is that at a community foundation, it's split. It's frequently that the community foundation will do all of the investing. They'll just take all the money and put it in one pool and then sort of divvy it up accordingly. At the Fidelity's charitable, the Schwab's, Vanguard of the world, it's typical that the donor recommends investment strategies, which is the same as having, pretty much has control over it, but they'll often get steered towards specific funds owned by that family, meaning that sort of organization. So Fidelity will say, we have a bunch of options for you, but it's Fidelity small cap, which means small companies, Fidelity mid cap, Fidelity large cap. It just means how big are the companies that we're investing in, Fidelity International Fund, things like that. So a lot of it gets steered into the funds that, that the parent organization owns and manages, and that way they get more additional management fees. It doesn't really behoove Fidelity to say, well, what about this Vanguard fund that you can do it as well? Kim asks, how does a donor evaluate a DAF versus creating a family foundation? I assume the family foundation is more expensive to set up than a national DAF. Kim, this is correct. So family foundations are becoming a little bit less popular as donor advised funds are becoming more popular. Now, part of it is you can get all that money in. Family foundations and private foundations usually have a minimum distribution of about 5% a year, I believe, maybe 4%. Someone can correct me in the chat. But there's a minimum threshold for which money has to come out. Donor advised funds don't have that minimum. Now, in practice, on average, more than 5% goes out of these, but you don't have control. Now, in some cases, and it's a little bit controversial, but sometimes family foundations are sort of set up so that you can employ one of the kids that doesn't have a job otherwise. And so there's some benefits there. That's both a benefit and a drawback, in that there's more work to do. And so it's a way to put people in the family to work if you're talking about much larger family foundations. But in terms of donor advised funds, pretty straightforward. You can open them in a couple minutes or maybe a couple hours if some verification works. And so the fees associated with that, both on setup and then ongoing, tend to be much smaller than a much larger family foundation. We have a bunch of questions from Brian. These are actually all great questions, so I'm going to try to go through a bunch of them. One, how are DAFs impacting the generational wealth transfer numbers? So if you don't know, there's something like $70 trillion that will be passed on from baby boomers to millennials in particular, sometimes Gen Z, in the next 10, 15, 20 years. So massive, massive wealth transfer. Some of you were with us last week. We talked about millennial major donors. So much of the money that millennials will have in 10 years will be inherited as opposed to earned. But 68 trillion is still way larger than the 100 billion plus that's in donor advised funds. So it won't be a massive shift. It is a good indication of who has a lot of money and who's going to pass on a lot of money. And so who might you want to engage the whole family in giving? But donor advised funds are a relatively small slice of that. Other question is, why would a family choose a DAF over a family foundation? We talked about that. Can someone transfer ownership of a DAF to their child, family member, or charity? Yes, so you can actually switch the key recommender there and give the entire DAF away. Or what you'd really do is sort of have someone else sign on as the ability to give recommendations and just allow that person to make decisions. Now, some of the community foundations that will differ. I mean, there's hundreds of community foundations and they all have their own rules, but as a norm, if you got married, if you want to do this with your child, if you had a close friend even, you could actually just sign them onto it and they would be allowed to make grants as well. Is there an out clause on a DAF in order to transfer the money back to the donor? Absolutely not. So once the money goes into a donor advised fund, it cannot come out. You've gotten tax savings on that. You can't do things like, I have a niece and nephew, another niece on the way, a couple of godchildren, and I can't say, this is the Patrick Schmitt Foundation that will only go to my godson Nalu. It's private benefit. You can't do that as well because that money's already been, it's already been tax-free. And so once it goes out, it can never come back, which is why, by the way, in 2020, these gifts spiked even harder than other types of giving, because if you have economic uncertainty, it doesn't help to keep more money in your DAF. You can never have that money back. So once it's out the door, it's out the door. Once the original donor passes away, does the charity still have access to the DAF? Or do they have to be written to the DAF as a beneficiary? So if there's no beneficiary, meaning if someone just fails to fill that out, then Fidelity or Schwab will take control of that. And usually they also have to disperse it to charities. They can't keep it for themselves. So good question there. Sandy asks, how does a gift from my DAF link work? So at its most basic, what you would want is someone who already has a donor advised fund. You would click there and it would have, the EIN number, the address, all the things that you might need to provide to a donor advised fund, as well as a couple of specific funding areas if you were open to it. So if you're taking donations specifically to the engineering school, you would want to list the areas and what they might note in terms of the recommended grant. So that's a big piece. What we see, someone also asked about what a tool like that would look on the stock tool. If you were linking about stock giving, there, we work with different folks and have very clear processes for each of the big banks, what you might give stock out of, making sure that that process can all happen in just a few minutes, because it can be a little confusing otherwise. Rob says, doesn't focusing on specific projects shift the focus from unrestricted to lots of restricted funding? So Rob's question, I assume, was in particular to how you might work with community foundations. The answer is yes. And so what you might understand is which donors are looking for specific project areas and which are open to unrestricted funds, and make sure that you can tailor your pitch in both ways. A lot of donors are looking to fund specific things, especially with community foundations where they tend to be a little bit more active and activist than sort of general donors in the world. Craig asks, how do we avoid mystery stock gifts by putting transfer broker info directly on the giving page? Craig, this is interesting. It's something that we've solved in-house. And what we do is we work with orgs to create basically tools that allow you to capture the information before revealing brokerage information. And so you now have a record of, wow, this person's trying to give me $10,000 in Apple stock. When that stock comes in, I'll know it probably came from Roger, who filled out this form and said he was going to give that much Apple. So really important. Bestie asks, how do you legally have to credit the DAF and soft credit the donor? So just as a little bit of background, hard credit often ends up being on things like 990s, where you have to list your bigger donors. And these are two totally different questions. So tax reporting, you do one thing, but if you're doing your annual report, it's not a legal document. And instead what you want to do is really credit the people who are recommending the grants. No one wants to honor Fidelity for giving you $2 million. Instead, they should honor this couple who donated to create this wing of the building or something else. So you can think of these as, people think of soft credit. What we really mean by soft credit is, who are we recognizing in key moments and stewarding? And that's the really important thing. And then your back office team will fill out the 990s appropriately. But you really want to think of those things as separate and not be recognizing Fidelity or Schwab in your annual report. Would you mind redescribing the main difference between grants versus donations from donor advised funds? So this is, these words can mean sort of the same thing. Technically, a gift coming out of a donor advised fund, meaning out of it, is a grant. So sometimes I would have said donation, but legally it's not coming from the donor, it's coming from the sponsoring organization. The same way a grant might be a foundation. From a foundation, you wouldn't call a gift from a foundation a donation, you would call it a grant. But that's really what we mean when we say grants or donations out of donor advised funds. It means I, the donor, told Fidelity or told the Houston Community Foundation to give this amount of money to the Red Cross. And so I'm not technically in charge, but I'm pretty in charge. And that is a grant from them, even though it feels like a donation from me. So let's pause there. It's 12:55. We'll give a lot of more content coming up. A couple of quick things just as we wrap up. In 2 weeks, on February 2nd, we're going to talk a lot about fundraising events in 2021. We spent a lot of time early last year helping people navigate how might you move to virtual, what might the timeline look like, should I start planning in-person events for the fall, should I be doing things virtually instead in the spring, how do we think about navigating those two, especially with so much ambiguity, so that that no matter what happens, we still have good outcomes. That will be really important. So that is a highly complicated topic. We have a bunch of great things to share. We also are going to do a lot of research in the next 2 weeks to figure out what all the smartest folks in the nonprofit field are doing, so we can share that back with you. But you can just make a note in the survey or otherwise to RSVP for that as well. And then 2 last things. One, that's my email address. If you have any questions or anything I can do to help, we're always here to be as supportive as possible. And then lastly, just a big thank you for joining. I know that beginning of the year has lots of stuff going on. I know that you have, some of you are teaching math at your kitchen table or looking after friends or parents or relatives who are sick and all this other stuff. So hopefully this was an hour well spent, and I'm really grateful just to have you join. So thank you again, and look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks. We can dig deep on the massively confusing but still really important fundraising event world in 2021. So talk to you all soon, and thank you again.